The Drop tells the story of a bartender named Bob who gives us a little lesson in drop bars. He explains that the streets of Brooklyn aren't the safest place in the world and that all the money from organized crime passes from hand to hand until it reaches a bar chosen at random to be the safe deposit box for the entire city. Even the owners don't know when their bars will be the new drop bar, so they just have to accept the money without asking too many questions. So Bob's only job is to tend to his cousin Marvin's bar and wait. On this particular night, Bob treats a bunch of regulars to a drink on the house which they use as a toast for a dead friend of theirs named Richie Whelan, something that Marvin, the former owner of the place, doesn't really appreciate. Bob tries to justify it by explaining that it's the 10th anniversary of Richie's disappearance, but Marv thinks that they should just get over it. Although he's a bit on the quiet side, Bob seems like a pretty good guy. So after closing the bar for the night and swinging by church for mass, he's on his way home when he hears something as he's walking by a house. Upon closer inspection, he discovers a beat-up little puppy crying in a trash can. But when he pulls the pup out of the trash, the owner of the house notices and comes out to see what's going on. Where she seems a bit wary of Bob, so just to be safe, she takes a picture of his ID and sends it to some friends. Seeing that the pup's in pretty rough shape, she invites him inside while it seems that somebody is watching them from across the street. Inside, while tending to the trash puppy, she introduces herself as Nadia and tells him that although she works as a waitress now, she used to work in animal rescue. While she's helping the injured pooch, Bob can't help but notice some marks on Nadia's neck. But she quickly changes the subject and informs him that the puppy isn't a boxer like he thought it was, and that it's actually a pit bull, which he says is a super hard breed to find a home for since most people think that they're dangerous. And apparently old Bob is one of those people too, so he tries to get Nadia to keep the puppy, but she tells him that she can't since she works a lot and explains that their bad reputation is mostly the fault of the owners. But Bob's still not quite sure, so he asks Nadia to give him a few days to think about it. At the bar, he runs the idea by Marv, who tells him that it's just a dog and isn't as big a responsibility as he's making it out to be. Meanwhile, outside, a guy named Fritz tries to talk his younger brother into helping him rob the bar, but his brother thinks it's a bad idea. Later that night, as Bob and Marv are closing up, Fitz and his bro come bursting in to rob the bar. Marv tries to warn them about whose money they're actually taking, but they're not really in the mood to chat and tell him to just fork over the cash. Before they leave, Bob notices that Fitz's brother happened to be wearing a broken watch. Later that night, after the cops arrive, Detective Evandro Torres introduces himself where he recognizes Bob as one of the regulars that he sees at church every morning. So as Torres investigates what happened, Bob says that they only got the money that was in the register and he couldn't get a look at their faces, but tells them about the broken watch. As the detectives leave, Marvin grills Bob for telling him about the broken watch, but Bob tells him that it just slipped out and says that everything's okay since they only got the money from the register. But Marv tells him that the owners of the bar are gonna want their money back eventually, so everything's definitely not okay. The next morning, after going to church and seeing a statue of Saint Rocco with a dog, he heads over to Nadia's to pick up the puppy, but comes back a few seconds later and confesses that he has no clue what to do with the puppy. So Nadia takes him puppy shopping, where they pick up some essentials, Nadia goes over the basics, and Bob decides to name him Rocco. But when they're all done and he goes to drop Nadia off at her house, there's some guy watching them from a car across the street. Once they get home, Rocco immediately decides to leave Bob a smelly gift on the carpet. Later, at work, Chavka Umarov, the owner of the bar, shows up with a random dude tied up with a bolt through his foot in the back of his van and tells Bob and Marv that it's in their best interest to find the guys that took his money. Meanwhile, Detective Torres asks for information about Umarov's bar, wanting to know more about Marv and his past with the bar, since he has a feeling that Marv had something to do with the robbery. Which turns out to be true, and later that night, Marv meets up with Fitz and reveals that he was actually the one that planned the whole thing and tells him to make sure that his brother gets rid of his watch since Bob noticed it. The next morning, Bob's trying to train Rocco in the park when Nadia comes jogging by and tells him that if he wants, he can hire her to watch Rocco while he's at work. Over at Marv's place, his sister tells him that their comatose daddy is going to be transferred to a worse place due to unpaid bills if the home that he's in now doesn't get their money soon. So she suggests maybe it's time for them to just pull the plug, but Marv gets angry at the idea of just killing their father because it's convenient and tells her that the home will get their damn money. Bob and Nadia end up bonding over their adventures with Rocco, but one day after she leaves, the same guy that was watching them before appears and compliments the dog in a way that doesn't seem too friendly. A few days later, the same guy shows up at Bob's house claiming that Rocco belongs to him and shows Bob a certificate for the chip in Rocco's neck. But Bob tells him that the dog now belongs to him since he beat it, so the guy leaves, but not before taking one of Bob's umbrellas on his way out. Later, at a coffee shop with Bob and Rocco, Nadia catches Bob looking at the scars on her neck again and asks him why he never asks her about them. He says that it's none of his business, so she just comes right out and tells him that during one of her relapses, she decided to take a potato peeler to her neck for some reason. But shortly after, the waitress comes over and kicks them out for having Rocco in there with them. While at work, Marv tells Bob that he feels like they're being watched and suggests that the guy looking for his dog might actually work for Umarov. Later, when they go outside to bring in some trash cans, Bob discovers a bag with some money and a severed arm that appears to be wearing the same broken watch from the robbery. So without missing a beat, Bob heads inside and is wrapping it up like a piece of deli meat while Marv gives him shit for mentioning the watch in the first place, when all of a sudden, the guy from before shows up again and says hi to Bob, but as Marv is kicking him out of the bar, he tells Bob to send his regards to Nadia. Marv tells him that the guy is named Eric Deeds and that he's the guy that claims to have killed Richie Whelan. Not too concerned, Bob leaves and takes Rocco for a walk down by the pier where he proceeds to chuck the arm in the water. But seconds later, Detective Torres pulls up and says that they haven't found the thieves yet, but asks Bob if he happens to know a guy named Eric Deeds who he thinks may have something to do with Richie Whelan's disappearance, and Bob's all like, no? When he drops off Rocco at Nadia's on his way back to work, he asks her if she knows Eric Deeds, and she says no, but gets all pissy and storms off when Bob implies otherwise. Later that afternoon, Umarov shows up at the bar, so Bob gives him the money that was in the bag with the arm, and Umarov proceeds to tell Marv that their bar will be the drop bar for the night of the Super Bowl, which happens to be the biggest night of the year for dirty money. That night, when he goes to pick up Rocco, Nadia apologizes about earlier, and Bob tells her that he's just concerned about her relationship with Deeds since he's claiming to be Rocco's real owner. So Nadia admits that Deeds used to be her boyfriend, but they split up when she realized what a douche he is. Bob says it's no big deal since everybody has a past, and over some drinks, Nadia proceeds to ask him about his past with Marv in the bar. So he explains that Marv's his cousin and they used to have a crew that made a decent buck back in the day, but when Umarov's bigger, better crew moved into town, they took over the bar, so now him and Marv just work there. Meanwhile, Marv meets up with Fitz and tries to get him to rob the bar again on the night of the Super Bowl. But when Fitz says that he's not doing it after what happened to his brother last time, Marv decides to tie up some loose ends by running Fitz over when he goes to leave. Later, after walking Nadia home, Bob comes back to find the umbrella that Deeds took sticking out of Rocco's cage. The next day, Marv pays Deeds a visit and asks him what his problem is with Bob, so Deeds tells him that he doesn't like the idea of Bob feeling like a big shot with his ex-girlfriend and now his ex-puppy. So Marv says that he has a plan that could help Deeds with his little inferiority complex and work out pretty good for him too. Meanwhile, Detective Torres manages to get his hands on Deeds' file and discovers something interesting. A bit later, Bob meets up with Deeds, who tells him that if he doesn't give him 10 grand for little Rocco, he'll go to the police to get him back just so he can beat him up again. Bob then heads over to Marv's house, where Marv tells him that he won't be coming in on Super Bowl night since he's not feeling well. Not buying it, Bob asks him if he's planning on doing something stupid, which gets Marv a bit peeved, so he tells Bob to get out. The next morning, instead of going to Bob's to get the 10 grand for Rocco, Deeds breaks into Nadia's place and makes himself at home until she arrives, where he forces her to get all dolled up and go on a date with him. So Bob brings the money and a gun to the bar and drags Rocco along just to be safe, where the night starts out pretty smooth as customers show up to watch the game and more drops start coming in. But all of a sudden, Deeds shows up with Nadia, where Bob tells him that he brought the money, but is interrupted by a call from Marv, who warns Deeds not to underestimate Bob, and then starts lining the trunk of his car with plastic, and then heads over to the bar, where he parks across the street and waits. When Deeds goes to take a leak, Nadia tells Bob that Deeds has a gun and was waiting for her when she got home and forced her to come with him to the bar. So at the end of the night, Bob gives Deeds the money for Rocco, but Deeds asks how much he's willing to pay for Nadia and tells him to open the safe. Realizing that Deeds is doing Marv's dirty work, Bob lets him in on a little secret that Marv used to be a loan shark with a bit of a gambling problem. And one time, a guy owed him a lot of money and ended up scoring 22 grand in Vegas and paid Marv back with it, but apparently Marv had been skimming off the top to pay his own gambling debts. So Marv saw the guy as a good business opportunity, and to get the rest of the guy's money while hiding the fact that he had already paid Marv back, Bob killed the guy and hid his body in an oil drum in his basement. And right as Deeds is getting annoyed with story time and demanding that Bob open the safe, Bob reveals that the guy was actually the same Richie Whelan that Deeds had been telling everybody that he killed. So after blowing up Deeds' fake street cred and then blowing his brains all over the bar, Bob tells a terrified Nadia that nobody will ever hurt her again before sending her along her merry way. Seeing Nadia leave alone, Marv calls Deeds' phone, but when Bob picks it up, they both don't say a single word. A little while later, Umarov and his men show up to dispose of Deeds' body, where he informs Bob that he's had enough of Marv trying to take his money, so he arranged for Marv to go on a permanent vacation and for Bob to take over the bar. They then leave, with Bob now all alone, with only little Rocco to keep him company. A few days later, Detective Torres swings by the bar to pay his condolences to Bob, who claims that Marv's death was a carjacking gone wrong, but Torres tells him that it looked more like an execution. While he's there, he tells Bob that Eric Deeds has gone missing and that the last place that anybody saw him was in the bar during the Super Bowl, and then points out that the last time that anybody saw Richie Whelan was also in the bar, and then notes that it's awful coincidental that Bob never happens to notice anything. But Bob plays it cool, so Torres says that Deeds will probably turn up eventually, even if it happens to be in an asylum, and reveals that locked up in an asylum is exactly where Deeds was on the night that Richie Whelan disappeared, so it's impossible that he killed Richie like he always claimed he did. And before leaving, he tells Bob that he bets nobody ever sees him coming. Later, Bob takes Rocco on a walk over to Nadia's, where he tells her that he understands if she never wants to see him again, but that he just needs to hear her say the words. But after thinking about it for a second, she instead tells him to wait for her to grab her jacket so she can join him and Rocco.